that you've left.
There is no corner flag. I think they hold a stopwatch and a set of cones up.
But how would you, would you put something out on social media or what? You see the same things, don't you? We'd like to thank him and his staff for all his hard work over this period, and we wish him all the best for the future.
It'd be a bit concerning if they said some of your hard work, or you didn't really work hard enough.
Maybe in the future. Yeah, well, maybe the manager turns around and says, "No, I'm not even. I wouldn't even dream of it." And
I'm not leaving.
I'm not leaving. Senses that opportunity, right? I'm close, but I've got to keep going. A club will go to an agent and say, "Look, do we need to probably have that conversation?" The agent then goes to the manager and says, "Look, the club said this. Do we need to have that conversation?" The manager's probably had enough and feels like the end's coming anyway.
Yeah.
And he'd rather go out with his head held high.
Welcome, football fans, to Breaking Lines, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the beautiful game like never before. I'm Gary Rowett, former player and manager, joined by the insightful Dave Carolan, a man with his finger on the pulse of football's beating heart. Together, Dave and I bring you unrivaled insight, context, and a few stories from the trenches. Join us as we dissect the game, break down the plays, and explore the intricate dance between managers, players, fans, and the beautiful game itself. This is Breaking Lines, where the game is more than just a match.
Now, as ever, Gary, we're on the beating pulse of the modern game. And when I drafted this script for today's recording, we were going to be talking about signing off from your club, and then Jurgen Klopp gazumps us with announcing he's leaving Liverpool to the whole world. And effectively, we could have thrown this in the bin, but it probably still rings true that how a manager leaves a club can be done in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's media managed or it's club managed, but sometimes the manager has to take it into his own hands. Is there a script? Is there a way to do it?
Well, the worrying thing for me was straight away, not many people thought this, and I'm sure you didn't think this. I thought, has he got a podcast coming out? And is that why he's leaving?
He can't be trying to take us on in the podcasting space.
Surely not. Come on, Jurgen. That's not going to be a good idea.
No.
It really interested me when he came out and said what he said, because I think most people weren't expecting it. I think it gives you a real insight into when you've been at, I suppose it depends on different timescales, but I think when you've been at a club a long time, whatever that time is, and in this case, I think it was about 8 years or something like that, the energy that it takes to manage with the same emotions and the same energy and the same drive and you lose a game, you go in on the Monday. We spoke about this so often. You go in on the Monday morning, you've got to be the one to lift the place. You win a game and you can maintain that feel-good factor, and your players that you're dropping, you've got to have those conversations with them, even though they're draining, and not the players, the conversations.
Well, it can be both.
But, you've got to have those conversations, and to go in every single day, and I suppose in any job that demands a lot of you, emotionally and physically, then, there sometimes comes to a point where you think, do you know what? Maybe I just can't do this forever, or maybe I can't keep doing this in the same place forever. And we've also had it where as a manager, that sometimes, and we can see it in our case, where sometimes when you've had that scenario, when you get to the point where you think, I just don't know if I've got the same energy to keep going at the same rate, and whether it's better to have a conversation with a club and see if there's a better solution for everybody and be honest. And then sometimes after 3 months, you've got that energy back. You're ready to go again. You're ready for, you've gone from 3 months where you think, I don't know how I can maintain this job and maintain this focus, to then 3 months later having completely renewed focus and energy, because, just that time away from the game and that little bit of separation gives you that little bit of drive. So I think most managers, either you come to a natural end. Your natural end is either time and you've done a good job and maybe you don't think it's the right thing to keep going, or your natural end is, or an unnatural end where you've lost games and your results aren't good enough.
Inevitable end.
Inevitable end, good shout, inevitable end. So both of those are quite predictable in certain ways. And then you've got the one in between where you think something might be happening, you're not sure, you hear rumours, you see some stuff in the press that maybe, there's rumours about your job or whatever, or or whatever that is, or you can sense a bit more negativity coming into that period. But you always feel like maybe you can turn that around, or maybe you can change that. So I think there's very different scenarios to leaving a club, potentially leaving a club, that being in your own hands, or that not being in your hands. And I think, sometimes that dictates the way that you deal with it.
So at some stage, like I'm sure there's a playbook for managers, or you must have spoken to others, is there a better way, like, to sign off as such? Is it going with grace, or is it like saving face, whatever you want to use the term, of actually protecting the club, protecting your own reputation and your own standing within the game, but also recognizing that maybe it's best that everybody part ways?
I would say it's probably maybe 50-50, I would say. And I think most managers, for different reasons, but I think most managers, it fits the same sort of timeline, if you like. So if you're not getting the results, or you have a period where maybe it's not going how you want it to go, and everyone will go through that period. There's not many managers that won't get sacked at some point. Like it or lump it, in some ways that's part of being a manager, experiencing those moments. Like, we're not all going to be a Pep Guardiola when you can maybe pick, you've been so successful where you can pick and choose your time to leave, or a Klopp where you can pick and choose your time to leave. Most of us, that time gets taken out your hands often.
Most people leave through the back door. Very few go out the front.
There you go. So I think a lot of managers will, almost choose to die on their sword. Most managers, listen, we're all in the same boat. We're all proud, like any member of staff. But as a manager, you're proud of your record. You always think you can turn it around. You always believe that there's a win round the corner. There's always that scenario where you never, ever want to essentially feel like you've give up a little bit. You never want to really do that. And I think there's the other side of it where most managers don't want to, like, if they're going to go down, they're going to go down because a club will do it to a manager. So I suppose if you're a manager, a lot of managers might go, well, I'm just going to go to the death. And if a club choose to sack me, then, I get sacked, and whatever that termination agreement is. But I might be able to change it. I might be able to change it with a win. You only ever want, you've seen it where, let's take an Alex Ferguson, for example. He might have been, Sir Alex Ferguson, sorry. He might have been at a point where he maybe, I don't think so because of his character, but he maybe thought, you know what, maybe I think I'm going here. He might have come in that week leading up to that FA Cup game, that famous FA Cup game where Mark Robins scored the winner, quite late on, I think, where he might have felt that week, am I going to get the sack? Is it over? maybe I've heard some rumours around. And then suddenly, like most managers, you're just hoping something changes. And that's probably the best example of someone scoring a winning goal. Rumours, it's always a nice story in it that maybe they would have sacked him, maybe they wouldn't. But all of a sudden now, he then goes on to be as successful as any manager in the history of the game, essentially. But yet could have been in that scenario. And
those were back in the days when, you'd run out of time after 3 years, not after 3 months, which is modern football, isn't it? You don't get results fast. You're immediately under pressure. Alex Ferguson was under pressure, kind of 2-3 years into his career.
But I suppose it's a good example of most managers will just keep going because you always believe that there's a win round the corner. And it's not for you, in some ways, it's not for you to decide when the end comes. That's how some managers will see it. It's not for you to decide when the end is there. It's for the club to decide, and your job is just to keep winning games of football. And then you get the other side where probably somewhere in between where a manager probably knows it's not quite working. A club probably knows it's not quite working. the fans probably know at that point it's not quite working.
They probably already told you.
They probably told you in no uncertain
unceremoniously.
terms. Yeah, hopefully in just one song, but usually you have about 3 or 4. I've got a story about it because I went to watch a game the other week and I thought it was bad at times when we've come to the end of the road somewhere where the fans start chanting, but actually this manager got abused from the first second to the last second of the game. It was brutal. And it was actually quite an interesting thing to watch. A bit macabre watching someone else getting it. And it felt a little bit sad, but I think it just shows I think it's the way the game's changing a little bit where, that's now becoming the norm if you're not doing well or if you're not winning games, I think. So anyway, so I digress slightly. But I think so you've got the manager that wants to go till the end because that's just the way it is. And I think that's most managers in most situations. And the club then have a decision to make. I think then there's that one where it's 50-50 where the manager knows it's probably not working and the club know it's probably not working. And often I would say the club would usually spark that conversation first. Now that conversation might be with the manager's agent first. Look, do we need to sit down and have a conversation? Nobody's saying it, but essentially what you're both doing is the club are probably fishing to see if the manager is ready to maybe do some sort of
Oh, really?
deal.
Okay, right. So they'll be almost like teasing the conversation out.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's never happened to me in that sense, but I've heard stories of that happening where, a club will go to an agent and say, look, do we need to probably have that conversation? The agent then goes to the manager and says, look, the club said this. Do we need to have that conversation? The manager's probably had enough and feels like the end's coming anyway. Yeah. And he'd rather go out with his head held high, have a mutual statement. This is not our recent situation, by the way, which I'll come to in a minute because I think that's the most live one. But maybe it fits both parties and maybe both parties are edging the bets. Maybe the manager would rather get out and it be amicable and he gets, let's say, some money. Let's say the club would rather not have to sack the manager. Because maybe that manager's a popular... We spoke about popular players and legend players. Maybe it's a legend manager and they've got to have that difficult conversation. Yes. But ultimately, they want to manage that scenario as fairly as they can. Maybe they want to save a bit of money, whatever. And so that conversation can happen. Maybe the manager turns around and says, no, I'm not even... I wouldn't even dream of it, and
I'm not leaving.
I'm not leaving. Senses that opportunity, right? I'm close, but I've got to keep going. So, or you get the third scenario, really, which I suppose is, that basically you probably feel it yourself and you feel it as a manager. And we come right back to the Klopp situation. And certainly that was a situation that I was in recently where, you've been away from home for 4 years. Well, we're both in the same situation, but you've been away from home for 4 years. You've just the energy of travelling up and down the motorway, the energy of, trying to win games and having that up and down situation of trying to get in the top 6, not quite making it, blah. And there's other different reasons in there. Sometimes key members of staff will leave and the dynamics change sometimes. And so therefore you get to that situation that I found myself in, which was genuine. I thought, you know what? I'm just going to go to the club and tell them how I'm feeling and see if there's some sort of scenario where, it can be sort of mutually agreed. And that is a genuine mutual agreement. Now, the club might not necessarily want to have that conversation, but they also don't want a manager that perhaps might not be quite as committed moving forward. Not in our situation, but might not be as committed moving forward. So I think there's different multiple ways of doing it, and whichever situation that is, I think that then dictates what happens next. And you've seen it before. Look, how have you experienced it when you've been at a club? Let's say not with me or with me, but you've been at a club and suddenly you might hear that, because often that news doesn't take a week to filter through, does it? Sometimes it can be you're sat there waiting for training to start and 5 minutes before you're due to go out, the owner comes in and basically within half an hour, everyone's sacked. Everyone that's going to be sacked is sacked. Done.
Yeah, it can be pretty brutal.
Pretty clinical, isn't it?
Yeah. I've had it where a long-standing manager, an hour after the game, it was done and dusted. And then it just takes time for the news to get out. You know, obviously the close senior staff know pretty quickly. Eventually then, I mean, it's different nowadays, isn't it? Because it doesn't take more than 20 seconds for social media to have somebody who's dropped the news, and it can be everywhere within minutes. Certainly in the past, it was easier to manage the breaking news as such. You know, it could be decided on a Saturday night after the game, but it wouldn't hit the papers maybe until a Monday, when the local papers would eventually be briefed on it. I think it's very different nowadays, but everything from it happening at away grounds, which is I always saw particularly brutal, where managers are relieved of their duties at an away ground. So
we've never had that one, have we? We've never had that one personally. I think most of ours, if you look back, have always been at the home ground, haven't they, or at training or whatever.
Yeah, or wherever it might be. You know, in fact, it generally hasn't happened that often that I've experienced where it's been at a ground, but the one or two times that it has happened, once at home and definitely once away, where it was just at an away ground, just feels like it's so harsh, because what does the manager do at that stage? Do they go back on the bus, or make your own way home?
Wow.
You know,
do you think that's happened? Do you think that's happened where managers had, I suppose if a manager's sacked, would you want to go back on the team bus? Or would you just want to?
I think it maybe depends where you are. You know, how far away you are. Have you got the option of getting transport? Like,
what do you think happens in that situation?
Well, for example, let's pick out a random place in the country that might be difficult to get back. Like, you could pick Plymouth or Carlisle or Hartlepool or somewhere like that, which is like potentially a long way from where you've traveled from. And, you know, getting back from there may not be easy. And if you happen to be relieved of your duties straight after the game, then, yeah, it's a long, lonely seat on your own at the front of the bus.
Surely the club at that point would have to provide you a way of getting home.
Bus fare home, as they used to say on Bullseye, you know. But yeah, I mean, it can be brutal like that, you know, where... Yeah. But I think now the speed of which I know fans on social media mock after every defeat, you know, they're posting a picture of a corner flag and saying this is what they expect in the next statement from the club, you know, because they lost the game. There's a lot to be said looking back at the Alex Ferguson example that we've been talking about, or even what we started with Jurgen Klopp, where it took a long time to eventually build the winning team. I look back to my time at Norwich, and the team that we had that eventually won the league at a canter was built over 3 years. And was progressing over that time. But nowadays, it's very, very rare for a manager to get more than 18 months where there isn't some semblance of perceived success before they're asked to leave. So it probably is like society is now. You better get fast results and continuous fast results, or else the quarter flag picture is being drafted, and so is the statement from the manager. How does that happen? Like, well, obviously, sometimes you see there's a statement, but other times you just see nothing. There's no communication. Is that part of the negotiation?
It can be sometimes. I think most clubs, of course, you're exactly right. Most clubs are so desperate for it not to be leaked, because it would be quite embarrassing if it's leaked. So I think most clubs would want to get their statement out quickly, because, you know, whether that goes onto, you know, Sky Sports, or whether that goes onto local radio, or whether that goes onto their website, of course, they want to control that news. And in some ways, rightly so, because I think that's the easiest way to do it. So when they make the decision, they want that out quick. Sometimes as a manager, depending on the scenario, if your severance deal, most people's termination, it's already set in stone in your contract. So they can sack you and you can't do a lot about it. And essentially, you're just going to get the way that termination has been written in your contract. So you haven't got a control over the parting statement. You haven't got a control over how that's shared. I think most clubs are pretty good. I think most clubs try to be respectful. You know, you see the same things, don't you? We'd like to thank him and his staff for all his hard work over this period, and we wish him all the best for the future.
It'd be a bit concerning if they said some of your hard work, or you didn't really work hard enough.
Maybe in the future. Yeah, well, you've had some high profile ones recently, haven't you? Essentially, where I saw the Troy Deeney one that there was a statement afterwards, and then it kind of rumbles on, doesn't it? Probably Troy has his say in the press as to how that ended. The Forest Green owner has his say in the press of how. Look, I'm not judging that situation or what was said in those statements, because everyone has a right to say whatever they want to say after the event. But it's unusual that it gets acrimonious post-statement, doesn't it? Usually
there's an agreement.
Usually there's an agreement somewhere, I think. Usually there's something drafted in there. And I think it's usually a fair reflection of both sides. As a manager, you want it to not affect how you're perceived for your next job. And as a club, you want it to look like you've done the right thing by the manager. And do you know what I mean? And you've made a difficult decision. So I think you understand that. Then what probably most people do, I've never tended to do this. In some ways, there's been some jobs I wish I had done it. And there's some jobs I was quite happy that I didn't. But often you would then get and I think the LMA are absolutely brilliant, by the way, but then you'd get the LMA statement that the manager would probably put out after that event, maybe 2 days later, where they've drafted something that either the LMA have drafted themselves, and there's a bit more detail to it, and it often thanks the fans, and there's still quite contrived statements sometimes, aren't they? But at least it gives the manager perhaps a chance to put some individual personal things within there.
Yeah.
Or often it gives the manager a chance to portray the good bits in a bit more detail, because often that statement's a little bit clinical, isn't it, when you leave a club? So yeah, there's different ways of doing it. And then, of course, you'll have scenarios where managers will now use social media to give a bit of a part.
Yeah, that's been an interesting development now, hasn't it? Almost, the manager who self-manages their own, or not necessarily self-manages, but who uses their own social media channels now to essentially tell their story.
I think what you want is, as a manager, you want the chance to not defend yourself, but if you've been sacked and maybe it's slightly harsh, as a manager, you always feel a little bit like you want the chance to defend yourself a little bit. Now, sometimes that opportunity comes when you're doing media commitments afterwards, or you're doing a podcast, or you're doing whatever afterwards. We'll give Jurgen Klopp a chance on our podcast, won't we, to give a little bit more detail, perhaps, to his
Jurgen,
decision.
come tell your story to Breaking Lines.
But often you want a chance to do that. Now, in some ways, going back to the Klopp scenario and going back to perhaps Guardiola doing it at times, where he's done it in the past, where he said, "I need a year out." I think he said it after. I think it was after Bayern Munich, wasn't it?
Yes.
Where he went to America. He said, "I want a year out. I want to experience a bit of travel. I want to, because it is a time-consuming, emotionally draining, all-consuming, 24/7, big impact on your family. I don't like saying it's a tough job, but it's a job that demands an awful lot of the people in it. And I suppose if you look at the absolute creme de la creme, it's being able to dictate when you leave a club. It's being able to dictate how that feels at the end of it. And it'd be interesting to see how the Klopp one plays out, because I actually think he will get just as good a reception, if not better now, for you imagine every single home game from now till the end of the season. He is going to be absolutely lauded, and rightly so. Might have an interesting effect on the players, but I think it'd be interesting to see how that dynamic, by naming it actually before he's going to go, because that's unusual, isn't it? He's not naming it and leaving straight away. He's saying, I'm going to leave at the end of the season. So he's giving people a chance. Interesting to see how the players cope with that, wouldn't it?
Certainly. And we also find out that a lot of his staff are leaving as well. So it's like I wouldn't say it's a surgical removal of a whole coaching staff, but whether they've chosen to leave or there was an agreement when they went in that they'd all leave together, but all of them leaving at once, it's going to be a real interesting time for Liverpool, but I think certainly how they're all doing it, they're getting to manage almost the story on the way out, aren't they? They're in control of the narrative around why he's leaving, how he's leaving, when he's leaving. That's so rare nowadays in any sport that you get to do that. I think the only one in recent times is probably fallen on harder times in NFL is Bill Belichick, who's leaving or has left the New England Patriots, hugely successful, just like Klopp was. But eventually maybe time runs out, or results run out, or energy runs out.
Yeah, I think that's the usual one, isn't it? That people get to the point where they just feel like they haven't got the energy to go again in the next season in the same way. And you don't want to be half the manager, do you? That's the key. You've got to give everything or nothing at all, I think. Interesting point you made there. So as a member of staff leaving, so you'll have had it in different... Let's take our relationship and when we've left clubs. So if you think about it, you've got Birmingham, Stoke, Derby and Millwall in a different way.
Yep.
All been sort of slightly different. But how does that feel as a member of staff where you've left with me sometimes, not necessarily down to your own accord? You don't necessarily have that decision, but because you're part of my close staff and we work together as a team, that you would just, if I get sacked, you would end up getting sacked. How would you, because you don't get a statement. You wouldn't get a statement, would you? You wouldn't get a short, cold statement that you've left.
There is no corner flag. I think they hold a stopwatch and a set of cones up.
But how would you? Would you put something out on social media, or what? How would you sort of? Because you're leaving, it's just the same importance level to you as it is to me.
Yeah, I think it just depends. I think you kind of know your place as well. You're part of the backroom team, so there's no expectation of anything like that. It's nice if a club does it, and at Millwall they did that. It was a nice thing to do, where they almost kind of at least acknowledge the fact that you're leaving the premises, and that they wish you well on your way. But yeah, I think it probably goes with the territory, doesn't it? You come in with a manager, you're potentially going to leave with a manager. It's not always the case, and sometimes they want you to stay, or they might want to stay for a period of time. But if not, I think you go in knowing that you go into a privileged position in a club, and that sometimes that when they want to make a change, or a change is coming about, that they want to create a clean slate for the next person coming in. And that might mean ensuring that it's as clinical as possible, and that the new manager or new head coach, whoever it is coming in, can do what they want. And that's the club's prerogative, as long as everybody's fair and equitable about it, which, to be fair, nearly every club is. They've got no reason not to be, I don't think.
No, and I think you're right in as much as that, you've got to think about it two ways, haven't you? Yes, you're getting sacked, or we're getting sacked, and essentially, or we're leaving, or whatever it is. And you've also, because you're thinking about yourself in those moments, aren't you? You're thinking about how it's portrayed about you and how you feel. But of course, that club, that organisation also has a duty to its fans, to the players, to the staff, to shape that as much as, we're going to, look for a new head coach. We're going to make sure we get the right person to carry the team forward and progress in a different way, or whatever that is. They've got that next step to think about. You've kind of just got that moment to think about. So I suppose if we're thinking about this, let's cue a manager having to order his own Uber from Carlisle back to London with a bin liner with all his gear in.
Yeah, that's going to be a harsh reality for someone at some stage. But I'll just go back to what we said at the start with Jurgen. If he is thinking of putting a podcast out, we've got more podcasts to put on our table. You may have European Cups, but we've got episodes.
Touche.
Boom! Big Jurg is on his way out of Liverpool. A fitting end to his Liverpool reign as he gets carried high out of Merseyside with slaps on the back, plaudits and a farewell tour. But for 90% of managers, it's the back door, a short statement and a bus fare home dodging irate supporters who get their wish for change. However it's done, the final throes of a manager's reign have a feeling of inevitability all round. Everyone probably feels that inevitable end, but perhaps just one more try to resurrect the relationship? That next win might be the one. Then it's the how, the when, and after it's decided, the messaging. Relieved of duties, mutual consent, terminated, are the buzz phrase which proclaim the end of one dynasty and the beginning of the next. The king is dead. Long live the king. Thanks for listening to this episode of Breaking Lines, the final formal episode of Season 1. We'll be back very soon with Season 2, so make sure you're subscribed for all the good stuff to come. Thanks for your support, the ratings and the reviews. See you soon.
I got 100